The explosion of anger, the emergency room doors swung open with such force that they nearly came off their hinges. Damien Hartwell strode through Memorial Grace Hospital like a man preparing for battle, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the linoleum floors with military precision. His jaw was set, his dark eyes blazing with barely contained fury, and his presence commanded attention from every nurse, doctor, and visitor in his path. "Where's Dr. Patterson?" His voice boomed through the pediatric ward, causing several patients' families to look up in alarm. "I want to speak to whoever is in charge of this incompetent facility immediately." Damien Hartwell was not a man accustomed to waiting. As the founder and CEO of Hartwell Technologies, a company worth billions, he had built an empire on the principle that everything had a price and everyone could be managed. But here, in this sterile hospital corridor, his money and influence seemed powerless against the one thing that terrified him most. The possibility of losing his daughter. Ruby had been admitted 4 days ago, with what the doctors called a severe bacterial infection. 4 days of watching his bright, energetic 8-year-old grow weaker. 4 days of medical jargon he barely understood, and 4 days of feeling utterly helpless. The combination had transformed his fear into something uglier: rage. "A nurse who refuses to back down, sir." "If you could please lower your voice," a young nurse at the station began tentatively, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the phone. "The children on this floor need rest and rest." Damien slammed his palm on the counter, making the nurse jump. "My daughter has been here for 4 days, and every single shift change brings a new face with a different story about her condition. I want consistency. I want excellence. And I want it now, or I will have every single person on this floor replaced by morning." "That won't be necessary." Mr. Hartwell, calm, steady voice cut through his tirade like a knife through butter. Damien turned to find a woman in blue scrubs standing behind him, arms crossed, with an expression that held no fear, no deference, and certainly no intimidation. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with chestnut hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, warm brown eyes that seemed to see right through his expensive suit to the frightened father beneath, and a nameplate that read, "Natalie Brooks, R.N., and you are." He demanded, though something in her unwavering gaze made his voice lose some of its edge. "I'm Natalie Brooks, the lead pediatric nurse on this floor. I've been caring for Ruby since her admission." She stepped closer, not backing down, despite his imposing height and obvious anger. "And right now, you're creating more problems than you're solving." "Excuse me?" The audacity of this woman was almost refreshing, though Damien would never admit it. Nobody spoke to him like that. Nobody the truth. Nobody dared to speak. Natalie gestured toward the hallway. "Your daughter's room is 3 doors down. Every time you storm through here shouting demands, she hears you. Do you know what she asks me every single time you leave her room?" Damien felt his anger falter for the first time. "What does she ask?" "She asks if you're angry because she got sick. She asks if it's her fault that you're upset." Natalie's voice remained steady, but there was a gentleness in it now, a compassion that made Damien's chest tighten. "Ruby is 8 years old, Mr. Hartwell. She's fighting an infection, dealing with painful treatments, and missing her normal life. The last thing she needs is to feel responsible for your anxiety." The words hit Damien like physical blows. He opened his mouth to respond, to defend himself, but nothing came out. In his mind, he had been fighting for his daughter, demanding the best care, refusing to accept anything less than perfection. It had never occurred to him that Ruby might interpret his fury as disappointment in her. "I'm not angry with her," he finally managed, his voice suddenly hoarse. "I'm terrified of losing her." Natalie's expression softened slightly. "Then show her that fear with love, not volume. Children don't need perfect parents, Mr. Hartwell. They need present ones. A father's awakening." Patterson appeared from around the corner, looking relieved to see Natalie handling the situation. "Mr. Hartwell, I can discuss Ruby's latest test results with you in the consultation room if you'd like." But Damien's attention was fixed on Natalie. For the first time in 4 days, someone had spoken to him with complete honesty. Without trying to placate him or manage his expectations, she had shown him a mirror he hadn't wanted to look into. "Can I see her?" He asked Natalie, the question coming out far more humble than anything he'd said since arriving. Of course. You're her father. Natalie's tone was warmer now. But perhaps we can try a different approach. Ruby responds well to gentle voices and calm energy. She's incredibly perceptive, and she takes her cues from you about how worried she should be. Damien nodded slowly, processing this information. He had spent 3 years since his wife's death building walls around his emotions, believing that strength meant never showing vulnerability. His business thrived on this principle. But parenting, he was beginning to realize, required something entirely different as they walked toward Ruby's room. Natalie continued, the medical team is doing everything possible for her. The infection is responding to antibiotics, but these things take time. Yelling at nurses or threatening to replace doctors won't speed up her healing. What will help is for Ruby to feel safe, loved, and calm. They stopped outside Ruby's door. Through the small window, Damien could see his daughter lying in bed, looking small and fragile against the white sheets. A children's cartoon played on the television, but Ruby wasn't watching it. She was staring at the door, clearly having heard the commotion in the hallway. The first real connection, Mr. Hartwell, Natalie said quietly, placing a hand on his arm. The gesture was brief but grounding. When you go in there, forget about being the CEO who needs to control everything. Just be Dad. That's all she needs. Damien took a deep breath and pushed open the door. Ruby's face immediately showed a mix of hope and worry. Hi, Daddy, she said in a small voice. Are you still mad? The question broke something in Damien's chest. He crossed the room and sat carefully on the edge of her bed, taking her small hand in his much larger one. No, sweetheart. I was never mad at you. I was just scared because I love you so much, and I want you to feel better. Ruby's eyes widened slightly. Her father rarely spoke about his feelings so openly. You were scared? But you're always so strong. Even strong people get scared sometimes, Damien said, surprised by his own words. Especially when it comes to people they love. From the doorway, Natalie watched the interaction with quiet satisfaction. She had seen this transformation before, though rarely with someone as resistant as Damien Hartwell. Powerful people often struggled the most with situations they couldn't control. And serious illness was the ultimate loss of control. Ruby reached up and touched her father's face. Natalie says it's okay to be scared. She says brave people are just scared people who keep going anyway. Damien glanced back at Natalie, who gave him a slight encouraging nod. Natalie sounds very wise, he said to Ruby. Maybe I should listen to her more often. A shift in understanding for the next 20 minutes. Damien sat with Ruby, not checking his phone once. Not thinking about the meetings he was missing or the deals he should be closing. He simply listened as she told him about the stories Natalie had shared with her. About the art project she was working on with the child life specialist, and about how the hospital food was actually not as bad as he thought it was. Natalie checked Ruby's vital signs periodically, explaining each step to both father and daughter in terms they could understand. Damien found himself watching her work, impressed by the way she balanced medical efficiency with genuine warmth. She treated Ruby not as a patient, but as a person, a distinction he was only now beginning to appreciate. When Ruby's eyelids began to droop, Natalie suggested she rest. The medication makes her sleepy, she explained to Damien. Sleep is actually one of the best things for her healing right now. They stepped out into the hallway together. Damien ran a hand through his hair, suddenly exhausted. I owe you an apology, he said. And I owe one to everyone I terrorized when I arrived. Natalie gave him a small smile. Apology accepted. But more importantly, Ruby needs you to keep showing up the way you just did in there. Present, calm, and focused on her, not on trying to control the uncontrollable. It doesn't come naturally to me, Damien admitted. Control is what I do. It's how I've built everything in my life. Children aren't businesses, Mr. Hartwell. They can't be managed or optimized. They can only be loved and supported. Natalie paused, then added, Your daughter doesn't need you to be perfect. She just needs to know she's your priority. As Damien watched Natalie walk back to the nurse's station, he felt something shift inside him. For the first time in 3 years, since losing his wife, He felt like someone understood the fear that drove his need for control. And more importantly, someone had the courage to show him a better way forward. He didn't know it yet, but this confrontation with a brave nurse was about to change his life in ways that had nothing to do with his daughter's recovery and everything to do with his own healing. When silence speaks louder, the hospital at 2 a.m. possessed a peculiar quality that existed nowhere else in the world. The fluorescent lights seemed dimmer, the sounds more muffled, and time itself moved differently. As if the building held its breath between the chaos of day and the promise of morning. Damien had long since given up on sleep, his body refusing to relax in the stiff recliner beside Ruby's bed. He watched his daughter's chest rise and fall with each peaceful breath, grateful that she could rest even when he could not. The past week had been a revelation. Following Natalie's guidance, he had learned to sit with Ruby without constantly demanding updates, to read her stories instead of checking stock prices, to simply be present. The change in Ruby had been remarkable. She smiled more, talked more, and the anxiety that had shadowed her eyes was slowly fading. But tonight, despite the positive progress, sleep eluded him. His mind kept circling back to Natalie, to her unflinching honesty, her gentle strength, and the way she seemed to understand things about him that he barely understood himself. Unable to bear the confines of the room any longer, Damien carefully extracted himself from the chair and slipped into the hallway. His feet carried him almost automatically toward the small cafeteria on the 3rd floor. The only place in the hospital that stayed open all night for desperate family members seeking coffee or a moment of solitude. An expected encounter, the cafeteria was nearly empty. Just a few scattered souls nursing cups of terrible vending machine coffee. But in the far corner, beneath a flickering, fluorescent light, sat Natalie. She was out of her scrubs, wearing jeans and a soft gray sweater, her hair loose around her shoulders. She looked different, more vulnerable somehow, though no less composed. She glanced up as he approached, and something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe recognition of a shared insomnia. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, her voice carrying a hint of warmth that hadn't been there during their professional interactions. "Can't sleep either?" "Damien," he corrected, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "May I?" She nodded, and he sat down. Noticing the worn paperback novel beside her cup and the shadows under her eyes that suggested this wasn't her first sleepless night this week, I thought. "Your shift ended hours ago," he said. "Did." Natalie wrapped her hands around her mug. "I had paperwork to finish, and sometimes it's easier to stay here than go home to an empty apartment." The admission surprised him with its honesty. In his experience, people rarely revealed such personal truths, especially to someone they barely knew. But then again, hospitals had a way of stripping away pretenses. When lives hung in the balance, small talk felt obscene. Empty apartments are the worst, Damien found himself saying. Too quiet. Too many rooms that echo with memories of when they weren't empty. Natalie studied him with those perceptive brown eyes. "You're not just talking about tonight, are you?" Walls come down. Damien leaned back in his chair, surprised by his own willingness to continue this conversation. "My wife Caroline died 3 years ago. Brain aneurysm. One moment she was laughing at something Ruby said, and the next she was gone. Ruby was 5. She barely remembers her mother except through photographs and stories I tell her." "I'm sorry," Natalie said, and the words carried genuine weight. "That's the kind of loss that changes everything." It does. Damien found himself talking, really talking, in a way he hadn't done since Caroline's death. "I threw myself into work because it was the only thing that made sense. In business, there are rules, strategies, measurable outcomes. You work hard enough, smart enough, and you can control the results. But parenting, grief, those don't follow any logical pattern." Natalie nodded slowly. "My father died when I was 12. Heart attack, completely unexpected. My mother fell apart for years afterward. I essentially raised myself and my younger brother while she tried to piece herself back together. That's too much responsibility for a child," it was Natalie agreed. "But it taught me something important. You can't control loss, and you can't prevent pain. The only choice you have is how you move through it. You can let it make you harder, or you can let it make you more compassionate. Damien absorbed her words, recognizing the implicit question in them. Which path had he chosen? He knew the answer, and it wasn't one he was proud of. I chose harder, he admitted. I built walls. Kept people at arm's length. Threw money at problems instead of dealing with emotions. Ruby deserved better, but I didn't know how to give it to her. Shared understanding the fact that you recognize that means you're already changing, Natalie said gently. Do you know what I've noticed this past week? Ruby lights up when you walk into her room now. Not because you're bringing gifts or making demands, but because you're actually there with her. That's because of you, Damien said. You showed me what I was too blind to see, just held up a mirror. You did the hard work of looking into it. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. The cafeteria's overhead lights hummed softly, and somewhere in the distance, a floor buffer droned its monotonous song. It was strange, Damien thought, how peaceful it felt to sit here with this woman who had confronted him so fearlessly just days ago. Can I ask you something? Natalie said finally. Why do you run Hartwell Technologies with such intensity? What drives you? Damien considered the question. The easy answer was ambition, success, the thrill of building something great. But sitting here in the small hours of the morning with someone who seemed genuinely interested in the truth, the easy answer felt insufficient. After Carolyn died, I needed to prove that I could still control something, he said. Every deal I closed, every competitor I outmaneuvered, it was proof that I wasn't completely powerless. But the harder I worked, the more distant I became from Ruby. I justified it by telling myself I was building a legacy for her, securing her future. But really, I was just running from the present. An unexpected crisis. Natalie's pager suddenly beeped, shattering the intimate atmosphere. She glanced at it, and her expression shifted immediately to professional concern. It's Ruby, she said, already standing. Her fever is spiking. Damien's world tilted. In an instant, all the peace of their conversation evaporated, replaced by the familiar terror he'd been living with all week. They rushed through the empty corridors, Natalie's sneakers squeaking against the linoleum, Damien's heart pounding in his ears. When they burst into Ruby's room, they found her restless and flushed, the night nurse adjusting her for a while. Ruby whimpered softly. Damien moved to her bedside immediately, taking her small, hot hand in his. Hey, sweetheart, he said, keeping his voice calm despite the panic clawing at his chest. I'm here. Daddy, I don't feel good, Ruby murmured, her eyes glassy with fever. Natalie was already checking monitors, consulting with the night nurse in low, urgent tones. Damien caught fragments. Temperature 13.5. Possible secondary infection. Call Dr. Patterson. But this time, instead of erupting in demands and accusations, Damien focused entirely on Ruby. He stroked her hair, spoke to her in soothing tones, and let Natalie and the medical team do their jobs. It went against every instinct he had, this surrender to expertise, this acceptance of his own limitations. But Natalie had taught him that sometimes strength meant knowing when to step back. The long night, the next few hours, were a blur of activity. Dr. Patterson arrived. Ordered new tests, adjusted medications. Ruby's fever climbed before it finally began to respond to treatment. Through it all, Damien stayed by his daughter's side. While Natalie moved seamlessly between her role as nurse and her newfound role as his anchor. Around 5 a.m., when Ruby's fever had finally broken and she'd fallen into a peaceful sleep, Damien found Natalie standing by the window, looking out at the city beginning to wake. Thank you, he said quietly, joining her. Not just for tonight, but for everything. I was just doing my job. No, Damien insisted. You did more than that. You gave me permission to be human again. Natalie turned to face him, and in the pre-dawn light, he saw something in her expression that made his breath catch. It wasn't just compassion or professional concern. It was something deeper, something personal. Damien, she said, and hearing his name from her lips sent a warmth through his chest that had nothing to do with gratitude. I need to be honest with you about something. Before she could continue, her phone buzzed. She glanced at it and sighed. I have to go. My shift starts in 20 minutes, and I need to change. What did you want to tell me? Natalie hesitated, then shook her head slightly. It can wait. Ruby needs you more right now. As she left, Damien stood alone in the quiet room, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Something had shifted between them tonight, something that went beyond gratitude or professional respect. And for the first time in 3 years, he found himself wanting to explore that connection, to see where it might lead. But first, he had to focus on Ruby. Everything else, including whatever Natalie had been about to say, would have to wait. A gesture misunderstood 2 days later. Ruby's condition had stabilized significantly. The doctors were optimistic about her discharge within the week. Damien, wanting to express his gratitude to Natalie, made with thought, was a thoughtful gesture. He presented her with a jewelry box containing an elegant watch, a piece from a prestigious Swiss brand that cost more than most people earned in 6 months. Natalie's face went pale when she opened it. I can't accept this. It's just a thank you, Damien said, confused by her reaction. For everything you've done for Ruby, for me, Mr. Hartwell, she said, and the return to formality stung more than he expected. This watch probably costs more than I make in half a year. Do you really think our connection, everything we've shared this week, can be reduced to an expensive gift? That's not what I meant at all, Damien protested. I just wanted to show my appreciation. Your appreciation? Natalie's voice was quiet but firm. Or your need to turn everything into a transaction? To put a price on human connection so you can feel like you've paid your debt and moved on? The accusation hit him like a physical blow. You're being completely unfair. I was trying to do something nice. Nice would have been a simple thank you. Nice would have been recognizing that what happened between us this week was about human connection, not about money or gifts or debts owed. She handed the box back to him. I don't want this, Damien. I never did this job for rewards. Then what do you want? The question came out more desperate than he'd intended. Natalie looked at him for a long moment. He saw hurt in her eyes mixed with something that might have been disappointment. I want you to understand that some things in life, the most important things, can't be bought or controlled. They can only be lived and felt and experienced. Until you learn that, you're going to keep trying to purchase your way out of genuine emotion. She walked away, leaving Damien standing in the hallway with a watch he'd never wanted for himself, understanding with painful clarity that he'd just made a terrible mistake. He'd done exactly what she'd accused him of. Tried to reduce their connection to a transaction, to something he could control and complete with money, and in doing so, he might have lost something far more valuable than any watch could ever be. The drawing that changed everything. The discharge papers arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on standard hospital letterhead, with Ruby's name typed neatly at the top. To most people, it would have been a moment of pure celebration. But as Damien read through the medical instructions and follow-up appointment details, he felt an unexpected hollowness in his chest. Going home should have brought relief. Instead, it felt like an ending, and not the kind he wanted. Ruby, however, was ecstatic. She'd spent the morning packing her few belongings, chattering about sleeping in her own bed, and seeing her toys again. But there was something else occupying her attention. A secretive project she'd been working on with the art therapy volunteer. Daddy, I need to give something to Natalie before we leave, Ruby announced. Clutching a rolled-up piece of paper, decorated with stickers, Damien's stomach tightened at the mention of Natalie's name. They hadn't spoken properly since the watch incident 3 days ago. She'd continued caring for Ruby with her usual professionalism, but the warmth, the personal connection they'd shared during that midnight conversation, had vanished behind a wall of cool politeness. I'm sure she'd love that, sweetheart, he said. Though he wasn't sure of any such thing, the final farewell Natalie arrived to complete Ruby's discharge checklist, her expression carefully neutral. She wore her professional mask perfectly, explaining medication schedules and warning signs to watch for. But she barely looked at Damien directly. And this is for you, Ruby said, thrusting the rolled paper toward Natalie. I made it special. Natalie's professional facade cracked slightly as she unrolled the drawing. It showed 3 figures holding hands, a woman with brown hair and scrubs, a tall man in a suit, and a small girl in the middle. Above them, in Ruby's careful 8-year-old handwriting, were the words, "My hospital family." Damien watched Natalie's eyes fill with tears that she blinked away quickly. "Ruby, this is beautiful," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the most special gift anyone has ever given me." "Really?" Ruby beamed. "Because you became like family to us. Daddy says family is people who take care of each other when it matters most." Natalie knelt down to Ruby's level. "Your daddy is absolutely right about that. And you, sweet girl, have been so brave. I'm so proud of you." They embraced, and Damien felt his heart constrict watching them. Ruby had bonded with Natalie in a way she hadn't connected with anyone since Caroline's death. And he developed feelings he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Feelings that terrified him precisely because he couldn't control them. Bittersweet departure, the goodbye process seemed to drag on forever and yet passed too quickly. Nurses Ruby had befriended stopped by to wish her well. Dr. Patterson came to shake Damien's hand and provide final instructions. Through it all, Natalie remained nearby but distant, present yet unreachable. Finally, there was nothing left to delay the inevitable. Ruby sat in the mandatory wheelchair, clutching her stuffed bear and the get-well cards from the hospital staff. Damien carried her small bag of belongings, and Natalie walked with them toward the hospital entrance. "Will I ever see you again?" Ruby asked Natalie, her voice small and worried. "Of course you will," Natalie assured her. "You'll come back for your follow-up appointments, and I'll make sure I'm working those days. But what about after that? When I don't need appointments anymore?" Natalie glanced at Damien, and for just a moment, her guard dropped enough for him to see the same question in her eyes. The same uncertainty about what happened next. "Well," Natalie said carefully, "sometimes people come into our lives for a specific reason, to help us through a difficult time. And even when that time ends, the love and care we shared stays with us forever." It was a gentle way of saying goodbye, of acknowledging that their time together was ending. But Ruby, with the stubborn optimism of childhood, wasn't ready to accept that. Or sometimes, Ruby countered, people come into our lives and they're supposed to stay. That's what happened with you, Natalie. You're supposed to stay. The note that started everything at the hospital entrance, Damien's driver waited with the car. This was it, the final moment. Damien helped Ruby into the back seat, making sure she was comfortable while Natalie stood on the curb, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warm afternoon. "Natalie," Damien said, turning to face her. "I'm sorry about the watch." "You were right. I was trying to put a price on something priceless, to create distance through a transaction, because I was scared of what I was feeling." Natalie's expression softened slightly. "I know, and I'm sorry for being so harsh. You were trying to express gratitude in the only way you knew how." "It's not just gratitude," Damien said quietly, acutely aware of Ruby watching from the car window. "But I understand if the only thing I'm leaving here with is the lesson you taught me about being a better father." He extended his hand for a formal handshake. Natalie took it, and the contact, brief as it was, sent electricity through his entire body. Her eyes widened slightly, suggesting she felt it too. "Goodbye, Damien," she said softly. "Take care of that wonderful daughter of yours." "Goodbye, Natalie." The drive home was quiet. Ruby dozed off within minutes, exhausted from the excitement and emotion of the day. Damien stared out the window, watching the hospital grow smaller in the distance, feeling as if he were leaving behind more than just a building. That evening, after Ruby was settled in her own bed for the first time in 2 weeks, Damien sat in his home office, surrounded by the trappings of his success. Awards on the walls, expensive furniture, a view of the city skyline that cost millions. Yet it all felt empty. He pulled out a piece of his personal stationery and began to write. The cafe at Donatali received the note the next morning, delivered to the nurse's station by courier. She recognized the expensive paper before she even saw the handwriting. Ali read. "Ruby told me something wise yesterday. She said that endings aren't really endings. They're just new beginnings in disguise. I've spent 3 years believing that new beginnings were impossible, that the best I could hope for was to survive with my walls intact. But this past week showed me something different. It showed me that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is allow ourselves to begin again, even when it scares us. I'll be at the Morning Light Cafe across from the hospital tomorrow at 7 a.m. If there's any part of you that believes we deserve a new beginning, please come. If not, I understand, and I'll cherish the time we had and the lessons you taught me. Either way, thank you for giving me back my daughter, and in the process, it's helping me find myself again, Damien. P.S. Ruby says to tell you that she drew you into our family picture for a reason, and her reasons are never wrong. Natalie read the note 3 times, her heart racing. Every rational part of her brain listed the reasons this was a bad idea. He was wealthy, she was not. He was her patient's father, blurring professional boundaries. He was still healing from loss, and so was she in her own way. But there was something else. Something Ruby had recognized before either of them had. A connection that felt right, despite all the logical reasons it shouldn't. A possibility of something real in a world that often felt too guarded and transactional. The next morning, Natalie stood outside the Morning Light Cafe at 6:55 a.m., her hands shaking slightly. Through the window, she could see Damien already there, sitting at a table by the window, staring into a cup of coffee with the same intensity he once brought to business negotiations. She could walk away. Go to work. Let this moment pass. Keep her life simple and uncomplicated. But Ruby's words echoed in her mind. You're supposed to stay. Natalie pushed open the door. A new chapter begins. Damien looked up at the sound of the bell, and the expression that crossed his face, pure relief mixed with joy, told her everything she needed to know. He stood as she approached, neither of them quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic. You came, he said, and his voice held a vulnerability she'd rarely heard. I almost didn't, Natalie admitted, sitting down across from him. This goes against every professional boundary I've ever maintained. Ruby isn't your patient anymore, Damien pointed out gently. And I was never your patient at all, no? But you were a parent in crisis, and I was the person helping you through it. That creates a power dynamic that Damien interrupted softly. I know all the logical reasons why this is complicated. I've been listing them in my head for days. But I've also learned something these past 2 weeks. Not everything in life fits into neat categories or follows logical rules. Some things just are, and we have to decide whether we're brave enough to explore them. Natalie wrapped her hands around the coffee cup he'd ordered for her, somehow knowing exactly how she took it. What exactly are we exploring here, Damien? Honestly, I don't know. He leaned forward, his eyes intense but open. I haven't felt this way about anyone since Caroline. It terrifies me, but it also makes me feel alive in a way I haven't felt in 3 years. Whatever this is between us, I want the chance to find out. I want that too, Natalie said quietly. But I need you to understand something. I'm not going to fit into your world easily. I work long shifts. I come home exhausted. I don't own designer clothes or know how to navigate your social circles. If this is going to work, it has to be real, not some polished version of real. Damien reached across the table and took her hand. I don't want a polished. I've had polished. It looks good from the outside but feels empty on the inside. I want real, messy, complicated, honest. I want someone who'll call me out when I'm being an idiot, who'll remind me what actually matters, who'll help me be the father Ruby deserves, and maybe, just maybe, the man I want to be. That's a lot of pressure, Natalie said. But she was smiling. Then how about we start smaller? Damien suggested. How about we start with breakfast and see where it goes? Breakfast sounds perfect. 6 months later, the pediatric ward at Memorial Grace Hospital had a new mural, funded by an anonymous donor, showing children and families of all kinds. In the center was a small dedication plaque in honor of the healers who see not just illness, but the people behind it. Ruby, now fully recovered, visited the hospital once a month with her father, not for treatment, but to read stories to the children on the pediatric ward. She decided she wanted to be a nurse when she grew up. Just like Natalie, Damien had made changes too. He'd stepped back from the day-to-day operations of Hartwell Technologies, hiring a CEO to run things while he focused on philanthropic work and, most importantly, being present for Ruby. His company thrived even without his constant control. A lesson he'd needed to learn, and Natalie. She'd learned that opening her heart again didn't mean betraying the walls she'd built to protect herself. It meant recognizing that walls could become bridges when shared with the right person. They took things slowly, dating properly, building a foundation of friendship and trust beneath the attraction. Ruby approved wholeheartedly, often reminding them that she'd seen this coming from the very beginning. One evening, as they sat together watching Ruby play in the park, Damien turned to Natalie. "You know what Ruby told me yesterday?" "What's that?" "She said her hospital family became her real family, and that sometimes the scariest moments lead to the most beautiful beginnings." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. "She's a very wise little girl. She learned from the best," Damien said, kissing the top of her head. And in that moment, surrounded by the simple joy of an evening in the park, both of them understood that Ruby had been right all along. Some people do come into our lives and stay, not because it's easy or convenient, but because they're meant to be there. Because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is let down our walls and allow ourselves to begin again.